Everyone is destined to die, just as everyone is born in an accidental place, time, and manner. While birth is now often planned, should that also be a matter of choice? The ethical dilemmas of euthanasia revolves around the right to die with dignity. So let's talk about what is euthanasia. Euthanasia came from a Greek word eu, which means easy, thanatos, which means death, commonly known as mercy killing. Types of euthanasia. Active voluntary. The physician administers lethal means upon patient's request. Passive voluntary. Life-sustaining treatment is withdrawn at the patient's request. Active non-voluntary. A decision is made to end a patient's life without explicit consent. Passive non-voluntary. Life-sustaining treatment is withheld without the patient's direct consent. Should mercy killing be considered as an act of compassion or an ethical shortcut? Let's hear some arguments against euthanasia. According to T. Gary Williams, it is morally wrong due to intentional killing. However, James Russell said that it is morally right if motives are humane and suffering is alleviated. Under Philippa Foot perspective, it is justified if explicit consent is given. And to Richard Brandt, it is ethical under prima facie duty to prevent prolonged suffering.
Applications of ethical theories. Natural law of ethics and euthanasia. Thomas Aquinas believed in moral laws from nature, opposes euthanasia by upholding the sanctity of life and encourages alternatives like hospice care. For example, a terminally ill patient requesting euthanasia should receive palliative care instead. Kant's ethics and euthanasia. Immanuel Kant, grounded in duty and universal moral laws, deems euthanasia immoral because taking life cannot be universalized, thus opposing it based on moral obligations. For example, a doctor refusing euthanasia despite a patient's suffering due to duty to preserve life. Utilitarianism and euthanasia. Founded by Betham and Mill, focuses on maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, supporting euthanasia if it reduces overall suffering and justifying its use in extreme cases of suffering. For example, a terminally ill patient in unbearable pain choosing euthanasia to avoid prolonged suffering. Pragmatism and euthanasia. It focuses on practical consequences rather than fixed moral rules, advocating that ethical decisions should be based on real-world outcomes and patient needs, and promoting case-by-case decision-making rather than adhering to strict moral rules in the context of euthanasia. For example, legalizing euthanasia with safeguards to ensure patients' autonomy and prevent misuse. Ross's ethical principle and euthanasia. It focuses on balancing moral duties such as beneficence, non-maleficence, and autonomy. Suggests that euthanasia may be justified if revealing suffering overweights the duty to preserve life, allowing for ethical flexibility in end-of-life care. For example, a doctor following a patient's euthanasia request based on beneficence. Rawls' concept of justice and euthanasia supports fair regulation for euthanasia, emphasizing fairness and equal access to care, suggesting euthanasia should be available under just and fair policies. For example, legal euthanasia policies ensuring equal access for all patients.
Now, let's move on to the next topic. Which school of thought is most acceptable?
If your moral compass is spinning, you're in the right place. Let's talk euthanasia and philosophy. Utilitarianism says, if ending suffering increases overall happiness, euthanasia can be justified. Pragmatism? It's all about real-life situations and practical outcomes. So which wins? Maybe it's not about picking a side, but blending both for a compassionate, outcome-oriented approach. What do you think?
Utilitarianism is acceptable on euthanasia because it prioritizes maximizing overall happiness and minimizing suffering. supporting the idea that ending unbearable pain can be justified. Pragmatism offers a flexible approach, focusing on real-life situations and valuing practical outcomes, making it adaptable to the complexities of individual cases and societal values regarding euthanasia. Together, this school of thought promote a compassionate and outcome-oriented perspective on the issue. What ethical principle the situation can be justified?
I'm sure you've heard the news. Can euthanasia be ethically justified? Let's dive into it. Kantian autonomy respects individual choice, while natural law emphasizes alleviating suffering. When these principles meet, some argue euthanasia could be justified if it respects personal autonomy and ends unbearable pain.
Some argue that Kantian autonomy and natural laws focus on alleviating suffering could, and very specific interpretations, justify euthanasia when respecting individual choice or ending unbearable pain are considered paramount. Personal perspective on the moral issue of euthanasia.
If you're a nursing student, you know the challenge of balancing care with tough ethical questions. As a nursing student, you'll confront some of the toughest questions in healthcare. Euthanasia isn't just a medical procedure, it's a moral dilemma. On one hand, it's about honoring a patient's choice to end suffering. On the other, it's about preserving life and upholding the dignity of care. Imagine a patient in unbearable pain, pleading for release. Do you respect their autonomy, or do you uphold the ethical duty to preserve life? The sanctity of life, informed consent, and the potential pressure on vulnerable patients. These are not easy topics. But remember, these challenges shape us into compassionate and thoughtful nurses. Reflect on these complexities and let them guide your journey in providing empathetic, ethical care. Stay thoughtful, stay compassionate.
As a nursing student, we find euthanasia to be challenging and complex topic that conflicts with the principle of patient care, dignity, and autonomy. It presents a dilemma between honoring a patient's choice to end suffering and the ethical duty to preserve life. While euthanasia can alleviate pain, it raises concern about the sanctity of life, informed consent, and the potential pressure on vulnerable patients. Based on our conducted survey, 80% of people know euthanasia, while 20% not. 50% believe that we don't have freedom when we are born in this world, while 50% don't believe. 50% of people agree that we have freedom to choose when to die, and 50% disagreed. 70% of people agreed in view of T. Gary Williams about euthanasia, while 20% disagreed. 10% is undecided. 60% of people disagreed in view of James Rachel about euthanasia, while 30% agreed. 10% is undecided. 50% of people disagreed in views of Bilifa Foods about euthanasia, while 30% agreed. 20% is undecided. 50% of people agreed in views of Richard Bruns about euthanasia, while 40% disagreed. 10% is undecided. 70% of people agreed to T. Gary Williams, while the 30% is into Richard Bruns. In the scenario of a terminally ill patient that requests euthanasia, 40% of people agreed to Ross' principle, while 20% to Rawls' principle and natural law. 10% is in Kant, ethics, and pragmatism. In overall, 40% of people don't believe in euthanasia, and 40% not sure, while the 10% is undecided and not sure if they believe or not.
Euthanasia remains a complex moral issue, balancing compassion, autonomy, and ethical principles. While some argue it alleviates suffering and respect individual choice, others see it as a violation of sanctity of life. Its acceptance depends on legal, cultural, and ethical perspective, highlighting the need for thoughtful and humane decision-making.